Hello, my name is Stephen Tierney. You may know me as Leading Learner at Twitter, and I'm author of the recently released book, Educating with Purpose, The Heart of What Matters. I started my teaching career in Blackburn in 1987, teaching science, and became head teacher of St Mary's and Elementary 18 School in Blackpool in the year 2000. After 14 years in headship, I became CEO of a small multi-academy trust that included St Mary's and two one-form entry primary schools, Christ the King and St Cuthbert's. For a number of years, I've been the chair of Head Teachers Roundtable. Now recently retired, the book talks about my experiences, my learning along the way, and some important underpinning ideas and theories. The basic premise of Educating with Purpose is that if the decade past focused on what works, which has brought a number of benefits to education, the decade ahead must focus on what matters. The purpose of education must move to the heart of the educational debate. Purpose is the associate and precursor of effectiveness. When considering what and how we educate, we must also be clear about why. Biesta describes education as a teleological practice. Telos literally means end. Education has a purpose, an aim, or an endpoint towards which we travel. I see education as contributing positively to people having a life well lived. People are the substance of education. They are what matters. A life well lived is a eulogy moment. It was part of the eulogy I gave at Mom's funeral, thanking family and friends for their help, support and love over her lifetime. Schools must balance the emotional well-being and mental health of children and young people with their intellectual development. If you like, schools have a significant part to play in making children and young people cleverer, but also happier, more confident and increasingly responsible. From my experience of working in Blackpool, I'd also add safer. The current telos for learning within education, according to Ofsted, is an alteration in long-term memory. That suggests the focus of learning is primarily intellectual and individualistic. Now, Professor Frank Cofield takes issue with this, describing Ofsted's definition as not fit for purpose. His concern is that it's more suited to psychological lab experiments than education, and so he offers an alternative. Learning refers to significant gains in knowledge, capabilities, attitudes, or understanding by individuals, groups, and society. His definition goes beyond factual and conceptual and beyond the individual. For Biesta, the point of education is that students learn something, that they learn it for a reason, and that they learn it from someone. As such, education always needs to engage with the question of content, purpose, and relationships. These more holistic definitions of learning give a more equal priority to four different philosophies of education, as opposed to Ofsted, which primarily prioritise one significantly above the others. A school's purpose has significant implications for the curriculum offered, operation of the pastoral systems, and the culture within the school. So it's now worth looking at what Dylan Wiliam describes as four underpinning philosophies of education. The four: empowerment, transmission, in terms of cultural transmission, employment, and citizenship. Personal empowerment seeks to develop the potential of the child. A balance is needed between the acquisition of skills and knowledge, both of which need to be applied. Underpinning this is the desire to allow young people to take greater control of their lives. The work of someone called Paulo Freire has a significant influence here. Cultural transmission seeks to pass on the best which has been thought and said. The focus is almost exclusively on knowledge acquisition and the development of the intellect. This would consist of both cultural literacy along with a more specialist curriculum focused on disciplinary and subject knowledge. Preparation for work focus is on problem solving and real world experiences, as more educated workers are more productive. There's a correlation there between educational achievement and economic prosperity. Preparation for citizenship seeks to build communities and overcome social disadvantage. This focuses on the school's context and seeks to support the development of social capital within families and the local community. Key to its success is ensuring young people are sufficiently well informed about substantive and current issues to make decisions and take action in support of the democratic process. In the book, I give readers the opportunity to consider the relative importance of these four different philosophies. The reader is invited to give a score to each from 1, not very important, to 5, very important. What is of most interest is the shape of the quadrilateral produced. The more regular the quadrilateral, the more the person gives an equal priority to the 4 different philosophies. A more irregular shape shows that 1 or 2 philosophies are considered of greater importance and others less so. There's a whole section in the book where experienced school leaders give their views about the different philosophies of education impacted on their overall purpose of education. Special thanks to Binks, who shared a perspective about the purpose of education in early years, Sabrina, who looked at purpose through a deep knowledge of leading special schools, Nav, who has a wealth of experience leading primary schools, Ross, who has led a number of secondary schools in the challenging areas, and Dave, who has a profound understanding of alternative education. Just a slight aside here, one of the challenges for the current system is that it's far more adept and focused on assessing and reporting outcomes that are associated with cultural transmission than the other philosophies of education. If you believe that cultural transmission is key and the others are less important, this wouldn't be a problem. However, if you believe that 2, 3, or all 4 philosophies must play a part in the purpose of education, then the metrics used by a current accountability system represent what would be called a construct under representation. That is, that there are important things missing from our assessment of schools and the education provided. Now, the first half of Educating with Purpose goes into much more detail about the 4 different philosophies of education, so readers can gain a fuller understanding of each. And I'll look at some of the implications for schools and the system more generally. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take you through some of that detail of the 4 different philosophies of education, so you get a flavour of what you might find within the book. So Paulo Freire's writings and ideas are heavily associated with personal empowerment in education, and his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is part of what I actually talk about in terms of the theory. His telos might be summed up in his own words as no longer part of the masses but one of the people. Freire views people as intrinsically linked to the world in which they live. They interact, influence and shape it. As such, life is not preordained. He sees the main purpose of education to give people greater control over their lives. That is, they become liberated as opposed to oppressed and have the ability to act without unnecessary limitations. He frames his sense of empowerment in the term subjectification. Subjects know and act, whereas objects are known and acted on. He challenges what he calls the banking concept of education, where education becomes an act of depositing with pupils, having no say in what is deposited or how. The interactions and power dynamics between people dictates the extent to which people are subjects or objects, and the extent to which they are able to become fully human or they are dehumanized. Freire sees oppression as the major barrier to empowerment, a ruling elite superimposing their reality and culture on the poor in order to maintain a social order that disproportionately benefits the powerful. A limited perspective from a person, controlling from a position of privilege, leading to discrimination, has had a negative impact on people of gender, race, ethnicity, different sexualities, disability or poverty. This is what Freire believes must be challenged. Naming injustice is insufficient unless that naming leads to the injustice being addressed. His call is for education to be praxis, thought and action. He rejects both verbalism, education purely as words or thought without any consequential action, and activism, acting without thinking. Interestingly, his work may well come back into significant focus alongside the Black Lives Matter campaign, which is shining a light on many areas of inequality within society. For education, issues around decolonising the curriculum, zero-tolerance behaviour systems, an overemphasis on the theoretical in the absence of any consequential action, lack of choice created by the EBAC, the impact of Ofsted as an all-powerful overseer, and the inability of teachers to control their work-home balance due to demands of senior leaders are all discussed within the book. Central to them all is the issue of who is making the decision and whether the person is empowered. Are they subject or object within the system? Freire proposes that education, as an act of cognition, should be built around the problems or issues impacting on people. These can be scaled up to form generative themes. We might consider climate control, equality and equity as key curriculum themes of our time. Now, this is going to be significant when we come to discuss the organisation of the curriculum, which I'm going to do a little bit later on. Moving on to think about cultural transmission, the best which has been thought or said is rooted in Arnold's view. Now Arnold sees the best which has been thought or said, not as a particular work or set of works, but instead as a process of critique. And Martin Robinson proposes that a good curriculum invites pupils into a conversation with the extended community of minds that stretch back into the past and will stretch beyond us into the future. Robinson sees a rich curriculum as one that tells stories that enables us to see more clearly, more thoughtfully and more wisely from a wide range of perspectives. I think that is just beautifully expressed. Now, much of the current thinking and implementation of a knowledge-rich curriculum, the best which has been thought or said, tends more to the acquisition of knowledge, increasingly within the context of disciplines and subjects. Alongside a willingness to learn lessons from cognitive science, which are relevant and implementable within the classroom, this has seen a real strengthening of aspects of schools' practice in the development of pupils' intellect. This focus on more specialist knowledge is viewed using Michael Young's idea of powerful knowledge. Young defines powerful knowledge using two basic assumptions. Firstly, that there are different types of knowledge, for example, that gained from everyday experience, as opposed to that contained within curriculum subjects. And secondly, that there is better knowledge. Now that could be problematic, but the term better knowledge is linked to structure and purpose. It's not about whether there's knowledge that's inherently good or bad. Benefits of subject knowledge is it enables pupils to move beyond their current experiences, acquiring new ideas or underpinning concepts that may be transferred and used in appropriate contexts. This knowledge is specialised and systemic. It's been developed with what Young describes as a well-defined focus and relatively fixed boundaries. Now, these boundaries help create the necessary separation that enables appropriate aspects of different disciplinary knowledge to become incorporated into discrete subjects. Powerful knowledge is also systemic. Its concepts are linked in an intentional way to create a coherent body of associated knowledge. Put simply, subjects are not random inventions of our imagination. The structuring of knowledge into subjects, how knowledge is arrived at, its relative subjectivity and revisability, and how the content is specified, sequenced and taught to be remembered, are visited in the book with the help of Christine Counsell and Tom Sherrington. These aspects take on great importance when we look at the principles associated with a subject-based curriculum that prioritises cultural transmission. Another element of cultural transmission is cultural literacy. E.D. Hirsch Jr. Is working from 1988 on cultural literacy in what he terms an anthropological view of education involves the transmission to children of the specific information shared by the adults of the group. It's a really useful read, and I cover it in some detail in this book. Hirsch sees this cultural literacy as a means by which a nation's citizens may communicate effectively with each other. Cultural literacy is built on a shared knowledge and understanding of key vocabulary, ideas and events that form part of a nation's ongoing language. Much of this knowledge has been used for considerable time. This is useful from curriculum planning as it changes slowly. Hirsch sees it as being set at a general rather than a specialist level. It is seen as most critical for disadvantaged pupils who are less likely to acquire the language at home, and part of securing an effective democracy. Now, this clearly brings into focus whose culture should take precedence within education. The imposition of the cultural norms and perceptions of history of a more powerful group on those who are less powerful or oppressed often embeds injustice within a system. It's what Freire would term cultural invasion. Now, moving on to the third philosophy in preparation for work. James Callaghan's Ruskin College speech proposed that education has two goals: to equip children to the best of their ability for a lively, constructive place in society, and also to fit them to do a job of work. Given the cost of education to taxpayers, it was considered reasonable that schools make a contribution to the economic prosperity of the country through preparing young people for work. Powerful knowledge in a disciplinary sense is subject to some debate. Powerful knowledge in life, that which will matter in terms of a person's economic well-being, is difficult, if not impossible, to predict beyond basic literacy and numeracy. From a curriculum planning perspective, this is problematic. The knowledge needed varies from person to person and is not known in advance. This has kind of considerable problems, and periodically it's led to calls for a greater choice of courses or programs for pupils from 14 to 19 and transferable skills to be taught. Now, whilst transferring skills between subjects is problematic, there is a set of skills that may be useful to transfer between contexts and for pupils to learn. The list of these often include things like good communication skills, the ability to work in teams, problem solve and lead a team, project management skills and at a personal and organisational level, including the ability to manage time, digital information and data management skills, and a strong work ethic. What is seen by businesses essentially is arguably marginalised in our current curriculum models. That is a choice rather than a necessity. Changing this requires a portion of the curriculum to sit outside the constraints inherent in a subject-based model. And I look in some more detail about how I used the extended project qualification to work with students on a number of these different transferable skills. The final of the philosophies is preparation for citizenship. Each school faces a set of challenges, often quite different depending upon context, when it comes to supporting the development of social capital within families in the local community. Citizenship is underpinned by a knowledge of issues and a sense of empowerment. It's about praxis, theory and action. Knowing that I should love my neighbour is often less of a challenge than actually loving them. The knowledge is not as powerful as the action. In the book, I write about a number of issues that affected my actions in Blackpool and the impact of serving a community which suffers from deep, deep poverty. By way of example, lower layer super output areas consist of geographical areas with about 6,000 to 9,000 people in them. Across England and Wales, there are just under 35,000 of these areas. When they're ranked according to level of deprivation, 8 out of the 10 most deprived areas are in Blackpool. The people from Blackpool suffer from long-term, systemic and profound poverty. Now, schools that prioritise preparation for citizenship will place an importance on the knowledge found in the local community. This is the embodied cultural capital that is formed by families and traditions from the constituent cultural groups. Such schools have a genuine and deep-seated belief in ensuring representation from the local community, families and the pupil body in the decision-making structures and processes within the school. Having looked now at the 4 different philosophies of education, which is a large part of the first half of the book, I want to look at some of these, some of the implications of these philosophies on the curriculum. It is what I describe as purpose enacted. In the book, I use Dylan Williams' curriculum design principles. A short summary of them and a downloadable PDF is available on the blog at www.leadinglearner.me. Just search for 7 principles of good curriculum design and it should take it to you. The 4 philosophies of education are all important, but looking at the impact of curriculum using Williams' design principles of balance, rigour, coherence, vertical integration, appropriateness, focus and relevance shows how compromises have to be made. You can then decide whether you're comfortable with the compromises or not and adjust accordingly. Now, in a school where the main purpose of education is cultural transmission through the teaching of subjects, the key principles used to design the curriculum are likely to be rigour and vertical integration. These principles are designed because of the specialised disciplinary knowledge being covered. A rigorous curriculum is designed to develop interdisciplinary habits of mind. The subject matter is taught in a way that is faithful to the discipline from which it's drawn. Vertically integrated curriculum is designed for progression. Within each subject area, knowledge is carefully sequenced. New knowledge builds on what was taught earlier, with each stage a prerequisite for future learning. There's also clarity about what improves when somebody gets better at the subject. Now, in a school where the primary purpose of education is personal empowerment, you had different curriculum drivers. The key principal drivers in this curriculum of personal empowerment would be relevance, balance, and coherence. A relevant curriculum connects or seeks to connect outcomes to the pupils being taught. It provides opportunities for the pupils to make informed choices. In developing the whole child with the aim of personal empowerment, there's a need for a balanced curriculum. That is one that promotes intellectual, moral, spiritual, aesthetic, creative, emotional, and physical development as equally important. A broad and balanced curriculum allows children to experience success in areas where they have a liking or leaning. It also requires them to experience different aspects of a balanced education to ensure that they're not limited by their own circumstances or current preferences. This is particularly important for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Unhelpfully, in many of the most economically and geographically isolated areas, access to cultural opportunities is often more limited. A coherent curriculum makes explicit connections and links between different subjects and experiences encountered. This tends to lead to a curriculum that is more thematic in organisation than one based on subject. It allows for teaching around real-world problems that are often multidisciplinary in nature. Now, similar to personal empowerment, relevance is a dominant principle in a school where preparation for work is the main purpose of education. However, relevance within this particular philosophy of education is primarily connected to choices about future career development. The juxtaposition between a more work-orientated project-based curriculum and its underpinning substantive and disciplinary knowledge creates an interesting interplay between the vertically integrated curriculum, and to an extent one that is rigorous, and coherent. So if you take engineering as an example, that's rooted in science and maths, both of which have a convergent approach to knowledge. They seek to produce overarching laws and theories. However, engineering is also governed by far more divergent thinking associated with design technology. Its purpose is to create practical, not theoretical solution. And so that curriculum now has an interesting set of compromises to make. There is a connection between personal empowerment and preparation for citizenship. Go back to Freire here, who believes that the pursuit of full humanity cannot be carried out in isolation or individualism, but only in fellowship and solidarity, to quote his own words. Consequently, in terms of the key curriculum principles, relevance, coherence, and balance all feature. However, within each of these principles, there is a difference in enactment, a move of perspective from the individual to the community, from the I to the we. As such, relevance is no longer tied to individual interests and aspirations, but aligned with what is important to the wider community. Aspects of local and family culture and the impact of current issues on the culture become aspects of the curriculum. In part, there's a need for a more coherent curriculum that cuts across disciplinary boundaries, whereas other aspects like music or dance and faith could sit within a more subject-based curriculum. For me, it begins to answer the questions of whether Mozart or Stormy, Da Vinci or Banksy should be in the curriculum. Both Stormzy and Banksy could be utilised to challenge some of the prevailing orthodoxy, while their works could equally be challenged themselves for some of their content. Their relevance is due to their commentary on society as it is currently perceived. Now, there's not time in the podcast to fully explore my thoughts around the EBAC and also what I refer to in the book as a shallowing of the curriculum, a consequence of maintaining a broad curriculum. Time is finite, so curriculum depth and breadth always sit in tension with each other. But in the book, I try and give some airings to some of the current challenges that we face within education due to some of the systems and processes we have in place. In the final chapters of the book, I give some thoughts about how I'd like to see the education system change as we journey towards 2030. The COVID-19 pandemic has created our generation's great pause, and we're likely to re-enter the world changed. Richard Rohr sees a parallel between our current experiences and the initiation processes that mark the shift from childhood to adulthood. No longer do we see life from our egocentric teenage perspective, this is my life, I can do what I want. We move into a bigger world, more complex world that involves many others. An adult world in which we create life and we're responsible for the lives and the well-being of others. This gives our lives greater meaning and purpose, the relatedness that comes from connecting, interacting, and caring for others. This challenges the sometimes immature, competitive, self-serving selves and systems we exist in. It's a call to be more than we currently are. In part, I describe this more as ensuring a preferential option for the poor, keeping closest to our hearts the most vulnerable, disadvantaged, and damaged within our society. We must all be responsible for the lives well lived of our nation's children and young people, not just those whom we come into daily contact with. For this to be a lived reality, we require repurposing our current education system. A number of our aspects of our current system need either changing or rebalancing. Two aspects I write about in detail is the need to rethink the current amount of curriculum content that we have. And I pick up Dylan Williams' outcry that teaching of a content-heavy curriculum is immoral, as it leaves the majority of pupils behind. I also pull heavily on a great blog from Solomon Kingsnorth, who looks at why Estonia outperforms England in maths. And it's simply by giving more time to teach what is most important. Gone is the intervention and booster industry that's blighted the final years in primary and secondary schools. I also look at some of the great work going on in Blackpool around inclusion and addressing high levels of permanent exclusion alongside general well-being. Creating schools that help every child and young person to have a life well lived balances a focus on pupils becoming cleverer, happier, safer, more confident, and increasingly responsible. It's a leadership imperative. The real substance of education flows from and to the person and the people. We're created as unique individuals. We are brought fully alive in community and must contribute to the common good. This is the I and the we of life. We need an education that seeks wisdom, the ability to make good decisions. This leads to a life in which individuals may flourish, but also a life in which each person seeks to help others flourish. Or phrased another way, we need an education that enables all to have a life well lived. We will sing into existence this future, one that will serve our children and young people and communities well. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk and found elements of it useful. If you'd like to read Education with Purpose, it's available via John Catt or on Amazon. With thanks to Alex from John Catt, who enabled me to publish a second book, and special thanks to Stan Dupe, who drew the fantastic illustrations in the book and used in this presentation. On screen are some contact details and where you can find me on Twitter or read my blog if you're interested. Thanks for listening. Bye now.